As I graduated high school and was going into college, I picked up this book and I started reading it, not this exact volume. I've been through a couple of copies of Mere Christianity over the years. I picked this up and started reading it, and it took me a while. I was into my first semester at college, still reading Mere Christianity, and that was the perfect time, by the grace of God. It was the perfect time for me to be reading this book, because I was getting into a very intellectual world at LSU, and especially the classes I was taking, did a lot in the humanities. And people were asking questions. Some people were challenging the Christian faith and raising objections that I would not have had the resources to really think through those objections and deal with them in a very robust way had I not, at the same time, been reading C.S. Lewis. And so this was an amazing book to ground me in my faith at that time as I was in college, to deepen my faith, to deepen my appreciation that actually Christianity is not just something where it's like the Bible said it, so I believe it, and that settles it. There are, there are deep reasons to believe these things, intellectual reasons, philosophical reasons. There are evidences for Christian belief that are available to our reasoning. And if you really think deeply about these things, actually, you may find compelling reasons that you should believe in Jesus Christ and in the Holy Trinity and in the kind of God that we're talking about as Christians. So C.S. Lewis in this book does not start with the Bible, though he occasionally will quote the Bible or allude to some of its teachings. He starts with universal human experience and our ability to reason as human beings. And he develops an argument, a philosophical argument for God's existence. And he draws on some of the arguments, of course, that have been out there in the Christian tradition and gives them his own flavor. The major argument he makes in this book is what's called the moral argument for the existence of God, which is an argument that I think is very potent right now in our culture, where so many people are concerned about issues of justice and injustice. And C.S. Lewis kind of asked, well, why do you have this idea that there is such a thing as justice that's real? And it's not just might makes right. It's not just me imposing my will on other people, but it's actually something that me and other people can actually agree about. We agree about what is just and what is unjust. And this is something that transcends us. It's something that's real outside of our own heads, outside of our own culture. It crosses cultures. It crosses ages. We believe in this thing called justice and injustice. Why? Where does that come from? What is that transcendent standard of right and wrong that we all actually know something about through our conscience and through our reason? What is that? Where did it come from? And he uses that to develop an argument for God. Actually, God is the only explanation that really fits for our belief in justice, that this is a real thing. And he deals with other explanations, isn't this to do with herd instinct, or isn't it to do with self-preservation and evolutionary biology? And he points out some of the problems with all of those objections. It's really a masterfully written book. Of course, it was written in the 40s. It was actually originally a series of radio broadcasts during World War II. So Great Britain is in the midst of this war that is an existential threat, as people like to say today, to their very existence as a nation. The bombs are falling. The Blitz is happening. Children have to be evacuated from London and Coventry and into the countryside. And in the midst of this crisis, this cultural, civilizational crisis, Winston Churchill's talking about trying to fight to preserve Christian civilization. And people don't even know, what does that mean? Should we bother with that? Is this worth it? And Lewis does a series of radio broadcasts to this war-weary people, trying to encourage them to return to what he calls mere Christianity, that classic Christianity, that Christianity that is held in common, whether you're Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, the Christianity of the ancient creeds, the Christianity of the Bible and the early church fathers, and so he's arguing to the English people when certainly after the First World War, many people lost faith in God, many people lost faith in the church, and Lewis is trying to call people back and persuade people to take another look at this whole Christianity thing. It's a marvelous book. It's a rich book. Certainly, it is a rational book. This is not a book of poetry. He's working his way through logical arguments step by step, but it's a well-written book. It's a book that I find actually very enjoyable to read. Of course, it is a dated book, and there are things that Lewis says or some of the ways that just he writes that will be off-putting to some people just because they are dated and they're from the 40s, and 50s. But nevertheless, if you just deal with his ideas, and even the ideas that you find off-putting and you don't like, hopefully by the time you've run across them, you realize you're dealing with an extremely intelligent and thoughtful person who's not just making stuff up. He's got a reason for everything that he says, and maybe it's we who are just blindly accepting by faith whatever the culture handed to us without really examining it very deeply. We've just felt what we like on an emotional level and not really worked through it logically. Lewis always challenges you to work through it logically. If you know anything about Lewis's life and how he was educated, that was something that was really inculcated in him at a very early age. He had a tutor. He was like homeschooled, I guess you would say. He had a tutor who would challenge him on everything. Why? Explain it. What are your reasons? Why do you believe that? Why do you say that? And so Lewis developed that very logical and deep thinking way of thinking and of writing. And so, gosh, he's also a saintly man. He's also a holy person. He was certainly an eccentric person, but he didn't just write about Christianity. He lived it. He gave sacrificially. And people tell stories about this, and Lewis's generosity toward them, and the way that he chose to give away so much of his income. He was a holy person, and so you're writing from somebody who had his own struggles, who had his own crises of faith, who had his own really potent conversion experience, and his own deeply held spiritual life, and his own he lived out the spiritual practices. So all of that to say, Lewis is a good teacher, and I hope you can see my love of Lewis coming through in here. There's so many good things in here, so many things that have stuck with me. He talks about the famous trilemma. He says sometimes people will say about Jesus, "Oh, I'm ready to accept him as a good moral teacher, but not as divine, not as the Son of God." But Lewis says, well, you can't do that. Because good moral teachers don't go around claiming to be divine. I mean, if you met somebody who told you that they were God and you should do everything they say, you would think that they were either crazy or they were evil and they were trying to manipulate you. Probably those are the first two things you would come to mind. You might take them seriously if there was something about their life or their personality that really was just so compelling. And he says that's what we've got with Jesus. He claims to be God, and he's either crazy, or he's wicked, he's trying to manipulate people, or he's telling the truth. And you have to look at his life, look at his personality, look at his character, look at his virtues, look at his teaching, and say, what do I believe? That's his trilemma, and it's a way of cutting through some of the ways that we try to tame Jesus, and people do this. I'm ready to accept Jesus as somebody that I admire, as a guru, but not as the Lord over everything about my life. And Lewis says you can't do that. You take him on his own terms or not at all. And he didn't intend to give you any other way. Actually, Jesus knew what he was doing. Another thing that strikes me, one of the arguments he makes in here, Lewis himself was an atheist for much of his adolescence and young adult and adulthood, I think into his 30s. And like many atheists today and people who aren't so sure about Christianity, one of his objections was, how can I believe in a good God when there's so much evil, injustice in this world? But Lewis says there's a problem with that argument against God. And that is, as I've already alluded to, where did you get this idea of justice? Where did you get this idea of goodness and how things ought to be? where did you get this idea of rightness? And are those real? I mean, are those real standards that are something objective? They transcend us. It's not just my own preferences or my own ideas or opinions, but it's something that's real. Injustice is a real thing, and how could God allow it? But if injustice is a real thing, that means justice is a real thing, and that means you have, as an atheist, the problem of why you believe that there is this real transcendent reality, this moral reality of right and wrong, of justice and injustice. Where did you get those ideas from? So the whole argument of the problem of evil, why is there evil, and using that as a reason to reject God's existence, actually falls apart. And Lewis points this out in a very, and everything that I'm telling you that Lewis says it so much better. He's a great writer. He can turn a phrase and have a pithy way of saying things, but he can say things in very memorable ways. So Mere Christianity, this is a book that rocked my world. This is a book that changed the trajectory of my life, because I started reading other Christian theologians. I started reading Martin Luther. I started reading John Wesley. I started trying to do business with even St. Anselm, and some of these major thinkers of the Christian tradition. And of course, that, I'm sure, is one of the reasons that I'm a pastor and have given my life to the service of teaching the gospel and sharing the truth of Jesus Christ. So Mere Christianity, not always a really easy read, especially for contemporary readers, but well worth it. It's intellectually rigorous, so you're going to have to think hard and put on your thinking cap, as my dad used to say, and really engage with it. But if you want a challenging read that will reinforce, if you're a Christian, reinforce your understanding of why we believe what we believe, or if you're not a Christian and you want to really be honest in your rejection of Christianity, you want to do business with it, not like in, what was that, Marr, that video Religulous, where he goes around and finds idiot Christians and then challenges them with the most brilliant atheists' objections. You need to, if you want to be intellectually honest in your atheism, you got to do business with the most brilliant Christians, right? Or else you're doing a straw man, right? So this is a guy to do business with, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. If you really want to think through our faith, Lewis is a great introduction to Christian apologetics and why we believe what we believe. So, Mere Christianity, I'm going to talk in this series about other C.S. Lewis books, because there are more that have really impacted me, but this is a great one. So until we connect again, may the peace of God be with you all. Amen.